Well, we're going to switch to English. Okay, Kasia, are you ready to start? Let me say a few words as an introduction. Yeah, I'm very glad that we have here Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek. Kasia is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Łódź in Poland. She's a hedonistic utilitarian. Her main research interest focuses on the philosophy of Henry Sidgwick, the concept of well-being and pleasure. Together with Peter Singer, she wrote two books, The Point of View of the Universe, published by Oxford University Press in 2014, and Utilitarianism, a very short introduction, also published by OUP in 2017. I have to say that she has published recently a new edition of Utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill's book. Apart from academic work, she is keen to convey philosophical ideas to a popular audience and has written on how to live a good life for popular magazines. Well, Kasia, you can start whenever you want. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for invitation. I'm very excited. I could say it's a great honor, but a hedonist will simply say that it's a great pleasure for me to be with you. I'm sorry we can't sit together still, but I hope that the time will come when travels are back, when joy is back, when we are all vaccinated and healthy and do not have to worry about the virus and the situation all over the world. I hope you're doing well and your loved ones as well. What I'm going to present you today is a part of my work that I recently put into a published book. Here it is. With pink glasses, yes, which say something about pleasure, that we look at the world through those pink glasses and the world seems much better. Why I believe it's a good idea, I hope I will explain today. So I'm putting, I put those ideas with the book that I wrote with Peter, The Point of View of the Universe, where we studied utilitarianism of Henry Sidgwick, but then looked also at the current discussion and current utilitarian philosophy. And now I have developed that, and I hope an English book will come out of it again, as well. So what should we bring about in the world and why? Pleasure. I've changed the slides. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, nice. So, as you well know, utilitarianism says that we should maximize the good in an impartial way. That's the statement of Henry Sidgwick, our beloved utilitarian, a 19th century philosopher, whom Peter and I believe is the clearest and best utilitarian ever. Quite hard to read. That's why students and philosophers usually read Bentham and then Mill, of course, but the Methods of Ethics by Henry Sidgwick is not so commonly read. Now, if we know that we should bring about the good in the world, of course, the question is, what kind of good? And so utilitarianism will answer this question, pointing to what is known as well-being, yes, as being well. In an analytical philosophical tradition, well-being is understood as what is good for. What is good for me, what is good for you, as a distinct thing from what is simply good. Yes? What is simply good is sometimes defined as so-called moral good. We can leave it for a bit now. Most important is what is good for and what is well-being. Again, in the tradition, it is called prudential good, because the question goes to me. Of course, utilitarians would point that we should aim at the good for impartially. That means that although the good goes to each of us, we should be concerned with this question in an impartial way, and that will be the difference between, for example, utilitarianism and egoism, of course. But in terms of a value, in terms of a axiological question, it is the same good for, yes, whether really we should aim at it in a universal way, in a utilitarian way, or in a partial way, in an egoistic way. Both those theories, utilitarianism and egoism, will talk about the same kind of good, which is a good for. Now, what is the well-being? Yes, what is good for me in a meta-ethical discussion? So in the discussion of what the term means. There were a few possibilities to define it. Fred Feldman's definition is well known. He used so-called a CRIP test, and he said, well, well-being is what you care for when you stand in front of a crib of your child, in a little bed, yes, of your newborn baby, and you wish this baby a good life, yes? So what you wish to this baby is the well-being. Of course, it's a nice analogy, I think, but when you look at it a bit closer, then you realize that you may want for this child what the child does not want him or herself later in life. So there is a question why there would be a well-being of your child that he or she doesn't want. And Stephen Darwell, another analytical philosopher, realized that, and he tried to make the notion of well-being more objective. So it's not actually what the parents of a child want for the child, but rather what they would desire for the baby if they cared for him or her in an objective way, yes? So in a rational way, let's say. So these are not actual desires and actual wants like with Fred Feldman, but rather objective ones that you should have when you care for someone you love. And there are some problems with this definition as well of well-being, as the question is, of course, what is rational to desire, or what is rational to want for the one you love. But I think that the rationality and the objective aspect of the notion of well-being is good, is a positive thing. Now, what is rational to desire for the child or for the one you care for? What is the well-being? Well, I believe it is something that would resonate with this person. So there are like two-level definition. There's a two-level definition of the notion of well-being. First, yes, it is something objective. It's what is rational to desire, but what is this rational? It is something that resonates with this person for whom, of whom the well-being we talk about. Now the resonance aspect is really interesting in the theories of well-being. I think Peter Railton was the first to mention it. He said, well, if we talk about the good for or well-being, there must be something that we care about. You don't want to name well-being or good for somebody this object that he or she doesn't want or don't think it's good or care for it. Not all philosophers, of course, believe the same way, and that's why we traditionally, again, divide theories of well-being into subjective and objective. Subjective theories of well-being are those that include this characteristic, this resonance, and objective theories of well-being in general say that we don't have to take it at all because what is good for us or what is our well-being does not depend on our desires, beliefs, or any other feelings. Now, a bit on subjective theories of well-being. As I said, according to subjective theories of well-being, what is good for us depends on our desires. And so the most basic and simple theory of such a kind is a desire-based theory with its own axiology, of course, but as you know, it's also accepted by a type of utilitarianism, and then you may name it as a part of a utilitarian tradition. Now, it's a simple theory. What is good for you is the fulfillment of your desires. It's, I think, very consensual, quite easy to understand and quite easy to agree to. But of course, there are plenty of troubles. For example, how do we know which desires we should fulfill? Those of the past or only of the present? I'm sure each of us dreamt once of things or desired things that we no longer care for. Maybe you wanted to be somebody that you would not even think of it now, or maybe you wanted to have something that you no longer believe is necessary, and so on and so forth. Another problem with desire-based theory is that we may desire things that will not have any influence on us, like a famous Parfit's example of a person we meet on a train, and this person is ill, and so we desire that this person gets better, and he does, but we never learn. Is it our well-being? Is it something good for us? Not for this person, of course, but for us, that our desire for him to get better is fulfilled. So there were different ways presented to overcome those troubles. One was so-called full information account. Maybe a desire-based theory is fine, but we need to think of desires only under this condition of full information. For example, Derek Parfit in Reasons and Person and now on What Matters show us that we sometimes know the information and still act quite irrationally. So we choose to do something that is clearly bad for us, although we knew what could come out, right? And so there are other possibilities, maybe not for information, but rationality. Hassani, an economist and a utilitarian Nobel Prize winner, believed, for example, that we should take into account only rational desires. And here again, what are the rational desires? Also, the problem is that if we take only rational desires into account, then the biggest advantage of the theory, of the subjective theory, the resonance, may disappear. Yes, we remember that the desire-based theory is a theory that says, well, this good connects with you, it resonates with you, you care for it, you want it. But if you say that we should fulfill rational desires, it may turn out that you never have them, actually. Yes, that you may never want rational desires. You want all kinds of desires, but not those which a philosopher decides is a rational desire. So in this way, the theory comes closer to an objective theory of well-being. And here it is. There are two main kinds of objective theories of well-being, the objectivist theory and so-called perfectionism. Objectivist theory is pretty simple. You think what is good and you name it. You make a list. There are lists of various lengths, of various kinds. You may think for yourself what is good for you, what you believe is good for you, and you may make this list for yourself. The important thing is that you make this list with a thought that the things that are good for you are independent on what you want and desire and even believe. There is no resonance. There is no this kind of belief that you are connected to those values or to the things that are good for you. So, of course, the theory can be, so that the main objection is of paternalism. Yes, so if you say, for example, that freedom or justice or even happiness is good for us, but I don't want them, then you behave like a parent of a small child that you believe is unable to decide what is good for herself. And of course, we usually think that if we are such parents, then the child will realize in future that what we told them is good, will be good for her or for him indeed. But at least in theory, it may not happen. Yes, in practice, that's what we do. We decide usually for small children. Then we learn, we teach them to make choices, and we hope that they will do the right choices. But what will come out of it, we don't really know. So at least in theory, as I said, it is a paternalistic kind of theory of well-being. Coming back to this division between objectivist theory and perfectionism, objectivist theory usually does not present any justification for it. Some philosophers say that it's prima facie. Some believe it's intuitive. Philosophers call it differently. But perfectionism is a theory that gives such justification, and this justification goes to our nature and to Aristotle. So often perfectionism is viewed as close to the virtue theory. It's not the same. Perfectionism of Thomas Hurka, for example, is not close to, it's not exactly the virtue theory. It's close, but there are important differences. Anyway, the justification lies within our nature. So a perfectionist must define our nature and say what it is and what is good for a human being in order, they say, to flourish. Yes, that's the word perfectionists and virtue theorists would usually use. Yes, flourish. And so the problem with this theory lies with this definition of nature. Yes, what is our nature? And one of the classical objections is that perfectionists define our nature in a pretty perfect way. So, for example, they leave out such characteristics as aggression or egoism or others that you can think of, and instead they present the good side of our nature. So the benevolence, for example, and the messiness and forgiveness, and so on and so forth. But as I said, I mean, generally, the problem both with objectivist theory and perfectionism, apart from the justification and all the troubles with justification, is that they point to values that may not resonate with us at all. And so in our book, in Peter and mine book, The Point of View of the Universe, I propose something that I call the hybrid theory. I thought that this division might be helped in a way with a theory that is in the middle, yes, that takes advantages of the theories and leaves the disadvantages. And I believe it's hedonism. Surprising. Why? First of all, I thought that hedonism can be an objective theory. Why? Because you may not want pleasure. Yes, you may want freedom, and you may want justice, and you may want other important things, but you may think that pleasure is less important. If so, if I don't define it as something that you desire, then hedonism becomes an objective theory. But now why it's hybrid? Because it has a very, very important subjective element. And this element is the pleasure itself. I will talk about it in the rest of the lecture, but you may now think of it yourself. So let's have a minute for our little experience and think of a pleasure that you have experienced lately. Yes, like right now. Think of it. Yes. If you think of it well enough, then you should feel a bit of pleasure now. Yes, it should come. If you think of a pleasurable experience that you had, it will come to your mind and you will feel it a bit. You may think it's a bit different, but you will still experience it. So the question, of course, is, how do you know that it's pleasure, and what constitutes the feeling of pleasure, right? I believe that pleasure is something that when you experience it, when you feel it, you can't help but like it. You can't help but want to preserve it. Yes. And now coming to the hybrid theory, if you agree with me at the end of the lecture, then it means that the theory is objective because you don't need to desire pleasure now, but once you experience it, it's such a feeling that in itself it's something that you like. Sidgwick called it desirable consciousness. It's a consciousness that is desirable, that you understand, you define it in terms of something worthy of your desire. It's not actually desired, or may not be actually desired, but it is worthy of your desire. And as I will show, it's something that can be defined as liking. Yes. And that's a subjective element. So I hope I can do that, and I can show you my way of thought. And of course, I hope that you would agree with me, at least for the definition of pleasure. Now, hedonism as a theory and as a theory of well-being has plenty of problems, of course. It's a mental state theory, first of all. So it says nothing is good but mental states. So nothing outside me, yes, nothing in the world, but everything that comes to the state of my mind, or of course your state of mind. Then, as I take it now, I want to underline that it's an axiological, not a normative theory. It's important with the problems that comes with hedonism, yes? So for a moment, don't think of hedonism as a kind of utilitarianism. Think of it only as an axiological theory. So it only points to the value. It doesn't say anything about how the value should be bring about in the world. So for example, I don't want to decide now whether you should maximize it or not, whether you should follow certain rules, how to do that, whether, for example, you should bring about pleasure in an impartial way or in a partial or even egoistic way. Yes, I don't decide about that. That's a different topic. Now I only want to show you why I believe that pleasure is the good in itself. It's the ultimate good, and it is the thing that we should aim at. Then the third important aspect of hedonism as a theory is that it's a monistic theory. So it says that there is only this one value at the top, and all other values are instrumental or conditional on whether they bring pleasure or not. I'm not sure. Yeah, I won't have at all time to talk about why I believe monistic theories are better than pluralistic. Just to summarize it, I do believe that monistic theory is easier. It's simply it has much fewer theoretical problems than pluralism. Classical arguments against hedonism. First of all, coming to Mill and saying something about higher and lower pleasures. You know how Mill wanted to overcome the argument that utilitarianism or hedonism is a philosophy for swine, yes, so the pigs. Mill said, well, there are higher pleasures that people should aim at, and we don't have to concentrate only on sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I think it's a total mistake. There is no such thing as higher and lower pleasure, and if something is good for you, it doesn't really, you shouldn't mind whether it comes from sex, drugs, and rock and roll, in quotation marks, or with opera and Nobel Prize winner in literature and so on. I will still try to talk about it, and if not, during the discussion. Then there is a classical, marvelous argument against hedonism in form of experience machine. Nozick's example. When I started going to utilitarian conferences in 2003, I met some philosophers that believed that experience machine is a total blow to hedonism, that hedonism cannot possibly overcome the trouble. I believe just the opposite. There are experiments showing that even if you don't want to plug in the machine because you believe you don't want to only experience things in your brain, but you want to experience them in reality. When I ask you whether you want to plug out of the machine, presuming that we are in so-called matrix, yes, or Plato's cave, whatever you choose. Most of the people do not want to plug out. So if I can confess, I really like my life now, and if someone from Matrix comes and say, hey, Kasia, you don't live in reality, it's a total work of a computer and a machine, do you want the red or blue pill? I say, no, thank you, I want to stay here. And so some neuroscientists and other philosophers asked why. Yes, so what's happening? And for example, Kahneman, Daniel Kahneman, came with a thought that what's happening is the status quo bias. That it is not that we don't want to plug in an experience machine because we want a real life, but it is the reason for our refusal is rather that we simply like what we have and we don't want to change it. Yes, that's the status quo bias. If so, then of course the argument is nothing of the strength that Nozick believed it is. And finally, one of the most severe objections is of the undeserved pleasures. So it goes to David Ross, for example, and his two worlds, one of people who feel pleasure and they deserve it, and the other of the world with people who feel lots of pleasure, but undeserved pleasure. So they are simply what we call morally bad people. I think it's quite a strong argument for a normative theory, and I would think more of it, but not in terms of a prudential good and a prudential theory of value. I don't have time now to speak more about it, but we can still discuss it later. So what is pleasure according to philosophers? For most of the time, since Locke at least, philosophers believe that pleasure is a kind of feeling or a sensation. So as I said, a kind of mental state. And Henry Sidgwick, as I just said, described it as a desirable consciousness, so a kind of consciousness. And it was a prevailing line of thought. Most of philosophers did not even discuss that until Gilbert Ryle, an important philosopher who in, I think, 1949, wrote a book called The Concept of Mind. And there he argued that what we take as mental states are simply observable dispositions. Yes, so it's not even an experience. It's not a mental state, but it is something that you show on your face. Yes, so I look at you. And how do I know that you are enjoying something, as Ryle says? It's because you are deeply involved in doing this thing. Yes, so I can observe it. So it's your disposition to be involved into something with eagerness, let's say, right? And Ryle has a very interesting discussion why pleasure is not a feeling. And he compares it to pain and says, well, utilitarians made this mistake because they believed that pleasure and pains are the same kind of experiences, only of opposite vectors, right? And Ryle says that's impossible. Pain is a sensation because, for example, when you go to a doctor, you can tell your doctor where it aches, but you can't say where the pleasure is, yes, in your body. So he said, well, then pleasure can't be a sensation. He enumerated also other reasons for that. So, for example, he said that a sensation can be separated from its source. so he has this example: when a shoe pinches and our heel heads, we can think about the aching foot without the source of the condition. Actually, I really believe it's a silly example. If anyone of you has shoes that bring you, aching heel or something, then you think of the shoes, I'm sure, not with very nice thoughts. But anyway, that's what he believed. And then there were also other reasons that he believed pleasure is not a sensation while pain is. I will come back to it in a moment, because I do believe Ryle is right. Pleasure is not a sensation, but it doesn't mean that pleasure is a disposition. And there came Fred Feldman, a well-known hedonist. He wrote a few important books on hedonism and pleasure. And he said, well, let's take an example of a woman who is giving birth. She's in enormous pain. She feels the pain. But when the child comes out and she takes the child in her arms, and to ask her how she feels, she tells you that's the best moment in her life. And Feldman asks, how is that possible? That you judge the moment as the best in your life, with so much sensory, what he calls sensory pain, in your body. He also gives a few other quite funny examples. For example, there is this person, Feldman calls it Wendell. So there's Wendell, who wants to have an incredible orgasm, and he buys a bottle of pills. Friends tell him that it's only an advertisements lie. He won't get an enormous orgasm, but nevertheless, he buys it, he takes it, and he has a small orgasm, only of what Feldman calls a few hedons. Instead of, let's say, 400 hedons pleasure, he gets only 10 hedons. And he's, of course, terribly disappointed. And he's sorry that he spent that money. And Feldman asks again, so if he did have this orgasm, small as it was, why is he so disappointed? Why he judges the situation as so disappointing? And Feldman wrote the conclusion from those situations that pleasure is not about sensing. Yes, he uses this word, senses, but it's so-called attitudinal pleasure. It's a propositional attitude. So what is the attitudinal pleasure? So Feldman says that attitudinal pleasure is a mental state that you hold toward a proposition. Yes? So you believe that the earth is not flat, you hope that COVID vaccines protect you, you desire that there will be snow next Christmas, and so on. And I will quote now Feldman. A person takes attitudinal pleasure in some state of affairs if he enjoys it, it is glad that it is happening, is delighted by it. But now, important thing, attitudinal pleasures need not have any feel. We know we have them not by sensation, but in the same way that we know when we believe something or hope for it or fear that it might happen. What's the problem with pleasure as a propositional attitude? Well, that it doesn't have this feel. So there was Daniel Hebron who pointed to that with Feldman's pleasure, definition of pleasure, all fun is gone. Yes, because you don't have to feel it. You just believe something. Yes, propositional attitude is this attitude toward the state of affairs in life. So, for example, you learn that fewer kids die from hunger in Africa, and you say, oh, that's good, that's good. So Feldman says that's your pleasure, that's your attitudinal pleasure. And some, including me, believe it's just too little. Yes, attitude is important, but it's not what you have when you are, for example, hugging your loved one, or you look at a beautiful view, or you listen to your favorite music. Yes, but again, I believe that Feldman is right, that pleasure is not a sensation. And now the most important aspect of my own definition, I believe that philosophers too often made a mistake of mingling feelings and sensations, and they should realize that feelings and sensations are separate experiences. And so, both in terms of Ryle and Feldman, I can agree that pleasure is not a sensation, but I would still believe that it's a feeling. And I will support my beliefs with neuroscience in a moment. But now, I will still talk about another aspect of pleasure, where I hope I'm making some progress in terms of philosophical discussion, mainly a philosophical question: what do different pleasures have in common? So I asked you to think of a pleasure. You can think now of different ones that you have. Yes, you may think of great philosophical debate, and a beautiful walk, and a beautiful sunrise, and music, and lovemaking, and great food, whatever you want. And now they seem really different, right? Reading and seeing a sunrise, and being with your friends and having fun. These are like different things, different experiences. So my question is, how do you know that they are pleasures? How do you do that? Yes, how do we distinguish pleasures from non-pleasures? How do we know that it's a pleasure and not anything else, if they are different? So again, there are two main answers. Externalists, such as Robert Crisp, would say, well, all the pleasures that we experience are united by the same characteristic. Yes, so it's such an element that is in all the experiences. And others, like externalists and famous William Alston, says, well, that's impossible, right? I mean, there's this, let me see. There is again this lovely Feldman's quote that I will read you about the impossibility of internalism. So Feldman says, I quote, "Consider the warm, dry, slightly drowsy feeling of pleasure that you get while sunbathing on a quiet beach. By way of contrast, consider the cool, wet, invigorating feeling of pleasure that you get when drinking some cold, refreshing beer on a hot day. Each of these experiences involves a feeling of pleasure, yet they do not feel at all alike. After many years of careful research on this question, I have come to the conclusion that they have just about nothing in common phenomenologically." And that's what Feldman believes. And he says the only common thing to all the pleasures is that when you experience it, when you are experiencing it, you desire it. Yes. So they say, externalists say, pleasure is an experience that you want or that you desire in time of experiencing it. There are, again, troubles with both of those accounts. Internalists, as I say, are against common sense, because probably if I ask you whether pleasure of reading and the pleasure of eating and the pleasure of lovemaking is the same pleasure, you would say no, it's not. But when you read neuroscientific experiments or neuroscientific data on pleasure, it will come that the data is closer to internalists than externalists. Why? Because now neuroscientists believe that pleasure and desire are two separate things. There are two separate hormones, there are two separate parts of the brain, there are two separate experiences. Well, I do believe they are right. I do believe, again, that there is a third way. There is, again, a hybrid way that I want to propose. And I want to support myself with the greatest utilitarian philosopher, that is Henry Sidgwick, who talks about pleasurable consciousness. So I believe that all the pleasures have something in common. And this in common, this feature, this internal phenomenon of the pleasure is exactly that it's a feeling that you take as liking, yes, as desiring. It doesn't mean that you need to desire it, actually, but it is something that you believe is worthy of your desire, that it is good for you to desire. This is a value judgment. Of course, in order to understand it, you need to come through a sort of phenomenological process of, getting rid of everything that is not pleasure, of cleaning the arena, if you can define it. And what I ask you to do now is to think that, for example, reading and eating and lovemaking are different things by themselves. Yes, so of course, reading is different from eating, and eating is different from lovemaking. But what is here important, that these are only the sources of pleasure, and pleasure is only, imagine it as an sugar icing, you know, that you put on cakes, on different cakes, on different desserts. So now think of pleasure as a feeling that you put on different things that you do. Yes, so you can take pleasure in reading, and you can take pleasure in eating, and you can take pleasure in something else, and they seem to you different only because those things that you do are different, not because the feeling itself is different.
Kasia, 5 more minutes to finish the talk. Is that all right?
I hope you're not too tired. So I support my arguments with, as I said, with neuroscientists. Magda Arnold was an American psychologist of, I think, 60s in America, and wrote a really important book on emotions and feelings. And here she defines pleasure as a feeling. She really believed that there are 2 main feelings, pleasure and pain. And whatever we do, we are governed by those 2 things. Our system, our mind, or our body drives us in those 2 directions, dependently on whether it is something useful or not useful for a human being. Now, the same thoughts are presented by Antonio Damasio, an Italian psychologist. And there are 2 important neuroscientists, Martin Kringelbach and Kent Berridge, working on pleasure. They edited a really important book, Pleasures of the Brain, where they not only state that pleasure is a feeling, but they also believe of this concept of, let's say, icing. Yes, that pleasure is the liking feeling that comes with whatever we do and whatever we encounter and whatever we meet. Conclusions very quickly. First of all, I believe that arguments against hedonism are not at all as strong as they were once believed. I believe they can be refuted. But my main argument for the pleasure and its greatest value is what is in its definition. And of course, I don't want to say that pleasure is the greatest value from the definition. That would be trivial and philosophically non-important. But I want to dig to the core of the experience. And I would like to show that pleasure is this kind of experience that is characterized by your feeling of acceptance, the feeling of liking, the feeling that it is a good thing to have on its own, as a feeling, that it is valuable, and as Sidgwick said, it's a desirable consciousness. There are plenty of things more here, but I believe if we switch to a discussion, it will be much more fruitful and enjoyable. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to a great hour of discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. If you could stop sharing your screen, I think that's going to be better. Well, thank you, Kasia. Let's open up the floor for questions. Abraham Sapien, please.
Hi, thank you. Thanks a lot for your talk. I wanted to ask you about 2 aspects of the theory that I think that will help me understand better what the proposal is. And the first one is about the possibility of Euthyphro dilemmas raising. So what you said at the very last end about desiring something that is somehow desirable seems I don't know exactly if that's what you mean, because there's this combination between internalists and externalists. But for example, in people like Chris Heathwood's theory of what constitutes hedonic pleasure, he says, well, you desire something because it's going to be desirable intrinsically, right? But that still has some problems to justify the very desire that constitutes the pleasure, which is, some people say that desire has to be instrumental or something like that. Or there's Michael Brady says, well, the property of, he talks about unpleasantness, but the idea is very similar. The property is about the relation of these two things. So I would like to understand how you avoid Euthyphro type dilemmas within the theory. That would be, and the second thing is how you could measure or have some idea of intensity of different types of pleasure, so you could compare them in very different aspects. So I think I can say, and it doesn't sound completely strange to say, like, well, eating a chocolate tomorrow is much better than reading just now. And it's like completely different types of pleasure, different moments in time. Maybe, or like eating something, like tomorrow having a cold drink would be so much better than reading a book. And I can do things like that, right? So I can compare them in different moments in time and in different kind of like sets of things. So understanding how you would measure those comparisons would be also very helpful to understand more precisely the proposal, but I really like it. And I thought it was very enjoyable to listen to. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for the very good questions. I will start with the much easier one about the measurement. I believe most of the hedonists now would say that measuring happiness is kind of impossible at the moment. But first of all, they hope to use some kind of neuroscientists, scientific measurements, maybe of fMRI or other types that could help with showing what's there in the brain and what kind of chemicals are produced within the process and so on. I'm not sure it would help me because coming back to your first question, I take it that what constitutes pleasure is not what I said, it's not a desire, but rather a feeling that is a kind of judgment. I know it's pretty difficult to imagine because I still want it to be different from Feldman's propositional attitudes. So it's not a propositional attitude, it's a kind of feeling. But it's a kind of feeling with a special characteristic. And this characteristic can be explained only in terms of what we call a comprehension, yes? So it's not that we desire it, yes? There's no this movement which I haven't yet defined myself. So I would have to think what is this desire, yes? But it's not the motivational thing in terms of pushing me to act, but it's rather a judgment of value. So imagine, I think it's a bit easier when you think of pain. Yes, so when you experience pain and a severe pain, you know that it is something that you dislike, yes, especially in itself. Yes, we don't talk about pain that is needed for something else. Yes, but some like silly pain. Yes, without further good reasons for it. So when you feel pain, you know that it is really something that you dislike, yes, that you judge in terms of what you believe is bad. Some say that pain and pleasure are two things that you comprehend, yes, comprehend as bad and good in themselves by just experience, yes. So in other words, you can't experience pain and don't mind it. Yes, you always mind it. As I say, the pleasure in the pain in itself. Yes. So I believe the same is with pleasure. The pleasure is something that you have to mind. I mean that you have to like, in a way. Yes, that it's this feeling itself. So I don't have this problem with desire, to answer your question in short, because I believe it's a different experience. And by the way, there were those wonderful experiments of neuroscientists now that show that what was thought the pleasure center, I'm talking about the experience of also in mind, yes, about the rats and the triggering the button or whatever they had there to experience what they thought was pleasure, was actually the desire, yes, not pleasure, but the desire. So it was not a pleasure center, but a desire center. And those poor rats triggered this button without eating and sleeping and so on, because they constantly evoked that desire, not pleasure. And I think it's pretty reasonable explanation what happened.
Can I have a quick follow-up?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So if what constitutes the pleasure itself is some form of judgment, wouldn't there be still some kind of eutrophiral structure of saying, but what is that? So is it good because we judge it as good, or do we judge it as good because it's good? And then kind of go into this double horn that you cannot take. So that's why I think that property will probably supervene just on the relation of the judgment. And maybe that would be a way of solving that problem, as kind of how Brady does in a desire type. So regarding it being desire or not, it's just about how to understand that pleasure feeling or hedonism, on what is supervening on the state of affairs itself, or in the relation, or kind of like which is the metaphysics of that. That regarding to the first one, and maybe that's enough, because the intensity problem and how to compare things, I believe there's a way, maybe in terms of desire and the priority of desire, that maybe comes from the other, let's say, like more higher level. But yeah, anyway, I mean, I have some thoughts on that based on determinables and determinates and how to make rankings. But maybe that's not as much as what your theory is now trying to propose.
Mm-hmm. Yes, since I would like to keep away from the desire, then it may not help, because I believe we can still make mistakes. So we may believe or desire, yes, we may desire pleasures that we believe are of higher value, for example, but we can make mistakes about it. Yes, so for example, we may choose pleasures that are of lower intensity because we believe that they are more honorable. Yes, so, or they are more fancy, or whatever word you use. So I would be careful about it. But coming back again to the first question, I think that what I would like to get, I'm not sure yet how and whether I can, but that's my dream, is to show that the feeling and its characteristic, it's the same thing. Yes. So in a way, there is no relation between pleasure and desire and pleasure and the judgment, because it's this thing. Yes. Only pleasure is not a judgment, but pleasure is a feeling, characteristic, characterized by the liking. Yes, the acceptance. But since it's a feeling, it's very difficult to grasp or or define, because it's not the separate thing, but it is this thing itself.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, Efraín Galloso, please.
Thank you for your talk, very interesting. And you said that pleasure is feeling, no sensation. So I am wondering, in what way pleasure is a feeling itself, no? Because I can understand that sensations and other affective experience are constituted by feelings, no? Maybe in a case of internalist theory is the feeling of pleasure, no? But I don't understand in what way the pleasure itself is a feeling, no? Because for that reason that I developed before, no? Sensation and other affective experience are constituted by feelings, but in what way pleasure is a feeling itself? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I understood you correctly. So there are different phenomena, psychological phenomena that going on while we experience something. Yes, we experience something by using senses, and these are sensations, right? So with touch, smell, and so on. And then there is this different phenomenon that both Magda Arnold and Damasio call a feeling, which is let's think it's a decision of whether sensations, thoughts, other experiences are good for us or not, right? So a sensation itself has no value judgment, right? It's something, it's a fact, right? You sense, you smell, you taste. But unless there is feeling, you don't know whether you like it or not, whether it's good for you or not. Mm-hmm. Only with a feeling, and both Arnold and Damasio believe that there are only those two feelings, pain and pleasure, with all the breadth of it, yes, wilderness, that would move you in a way toward, for example, eating something longer, yes, or stop eating it. So there is this example of let's say eating a chocolate. Right? You start eating a chocolate, you taste it, it's in your mouth, and you decide, oh, it's good, it's pleasurable, yes? So you continue doing that. Sensations then change because, for example, you become full, too much chocolate, too much sugar, and the body tells you, well, it's too much. So you get the feeling over the sensation that it's no longer pleasurable, just the opposite, right? And then you probably, as a person who makes choices, you stop doing that. Does it answer your question?
Yes, but I don't know. It's that sensation has some like feeling, but I don't see how is the pleasure of feeling, no? Of feeling pleasure in that experiences. I think that is diverse feelings in each experience, but I don't see how is the common feeling of pleasure in that experience. I don't know this.
You don't know how it comes about, or you don't know how it comes that you get the feeling of pleasure? of
Yeah.
after eating? I mean, you are asking me about the source of it, or the the biological story behind pleasure?
Yeah. What is the common in that? Yes. If okay, it's complex. That is no problem, because
Okay.
I have in mind cases in the heterogenic problem, no, the famous heterogenic problem in the affective experience, no? It's not the same, the taste of chocolate, it's not the same, the experience of love, etc., no? So if you say that pleasure is a feeling itself, how is or what is the characteristics of that feeling, no? How
Yeah.
how we can't recognize the pleasure, the feeling of pleasure in all experience.
Okay.
Yeah, that
Okay.
is
So,
yes.
So I can explain it only in terms of this desirability. Yes, that with different and very complex experiences that you build, there is this element that you realize, that you, I use the word comprehend, that you realize that what is happening to you is desirable. Yes, so it is good. But I mean, maybe I should say that I define it for a special group of beings that are people or beings who are able to think in terms of good, value, bad, and so on. Yes. So this definition of pleasure is for a human being in a way, as we know it. Yes. Maybe the definition of pleasure for an animal could be a bit different. Yes, for example, given in terms of its feature for this animal. But we use a set of vocabulary, and we, I believe, think in a normative way about norms and values and so on. And there is this something extra. And so I allow myself to borrow it, yes, to take it, to use it, and to say that when you experience pleasure, you inevitably judge it in terms of this desirability or of value and so on. So that's how you can differentiate an experience of pleasure from all other experiences.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kasia, I have a question. I want to ask you about something you mentioned just in passing. You said that one of the advantages of the kind of version of hedonism that you endorse is comes from the fact that it is a monist theory, that it is not a pluralistic theory. But I think that there are many problems that may come from that monism, yeah. And probably the first one I could think of is the fact that monistic theories do not recognize any kind, or do not recognize genuine moral dilemmas, do not recognize genuine value conflict, yeah, because there's always going to be this super value, yeah, the value of pleasure that is going to somehow deal with the different conflicts of values. So any value conflict is going to be only apparent, yeah. Whereas in a pluralistic framework, there is a possibility of recognizing genuine value conflicts. Can you say something about this?
Yes, thank you. It's a wonderful point. I think it's close to what Bernard Williams once said. Yes. So the fact that, for example, when I'm with my kids, I realize that I should be working and doing philosophy, and then I realize that I should be cooking dinner and something else, just shows that my world of values is wild. Yes, that it's vast. There are many values that I want to bring about in the world. In a way, it's true. So first of all, it's true on the level of common sense, that we believe that there are many values and that we want to bring them about in the world. But then there are two questions about it. First is whether we would care of any of them if they didn't bring us desirable consciousness. Yes. So this positive feeling of acceptance, the situation in which we are. And this is really Henry Sidgwick's questions again. Yes. So he says, well, would we care about freedom and would we care about justice if we didn't like them in a way? And the other thing is, I think, right, that I don't like dilemmas or I want to overcome them. Yes, I feel that that there must be a guidance. Yes, maybe there is this, desire in me to find a proper guidance, and I worry that with pluralistic theories, it's impossible, or maybe you need to end up with particularism, yes, some kind of particularistic theory in which you need to decide every time what to do. I think you are very right that I'm a kind of person who wants to get the troubles out of my way, even if getting into another one that is mainly putting everything under the umbrella of pleasure. Yes. I also believe that we make quite a lot of mistakes in terms of choosing our values, and that some choices of those values are depend on the culture or religion that we are in, and that's probably what worries me as well, that simply our pluralistic judgments about values are sometimes irrational. For example, we have this discussion in Poland now about the rationality of what was during the Second World War we call Warsaw Uprisal. It was in 1944 when in Warsaw, in our capital, we started uprisal against Nazis, and it brought a terrible devastation of the whole city, death of hundreds of thousands of people. It made no sense at all in terms of consequences. Yes, in terms of the outcome. But some people said that it was a sign of our honorable thinking. Yes, so there is this honor of the virtue of doing what needs to be done, even if the consequences were terrible. And I think now that you can see how people change their thinking about values, how the value of fighting, even against enemy, is taking as less important than the value of preservation of your life. Yes, which is very different, and you can see the line of the change. So Answering your question, I would say that it's not only desire to make things easier and to give reason the possibility of a guidance, but also I simply worry that some of the values that we choose are irrational to have, and that they are based on what I said, culture and religion and so on. How about that?
Okay, thank you. Aurelia Valero, please.
Thank you for your talk. I found it, well, very pleasurable, which I guess it makes a lot of sense.
Oh, terrific.
I wanted to ask you, well, I'm not very clear if your account of pleasure is a descriptive one, or if it also has a normative dimension to it as a way of orienting action, and also how can it contribute to social theory of action, of organized action? I mean, I guess, it has to do with the fact that I might consider it centered in the individual, even though it can be fulfilled, for example, in achieving social justice. But I wonder, how can individuals organize around pleasure for collective action?
Mm-hmm. These are very good questions. So first of all, I think the definition of pleasure is descriptive, but it has a normative element. In a way, if there is no normative element to it, it's not pleasure for a human being, for a rational human being. Again, I borrowed this very idea from Sidgwick, who made this distinction into rational beings and non-rational beings. And he said, well, this rational being who uses a certain vocabulary will use it when they experience pleasure. So you may take it as a description of what is happening, or what is happening in your mind when you experience pleasure. But what is happening when you experience pleasure is always on the normative level. Yes. In this way, you cannot be indifferent to pleasure. It's always something that's positive. And about the second question, that's a very good question that I believe utilitarians using hedonism could worry about. I think now that hedonism, if taken as a value theory, as an axiological theory that tries to show what is good for you, goes to on a private level. Yes, so it's trying to answer the question of what you should do, yes, or what you should aim about, or what is your good life. And only on the normative level, you try to think of how to use the theory to, for example, maximize pleasure on the social level, yes, so for the whole world. And there are great problems with it, of course. First of all, because a feeling of pleasure is subjective. Second, because I need to learn what brings you pleasure, right? And what brings pleasure to millions of people. Fortunately, I think that we are quite similar in our nature, and at least basic pleasures are quite similar, and those which we call higher or higher level pleasure still come from the basic ones, yes, so from the need of food, shelter, and company, for example, yes, social one. In terms of giving certain principles or rules, Now, a general point, I believe that, for example, deontology or Kantianism is better for that purpose than utilitarianism itself, because it gives, again, a clearer guidance, and it is objective, doesn't rely on subjective feelings and so on. But I'm absolutely sure that we should aim at the minimalization of suffering, for example, of depression, which is one of the biggest source of unhappiness in the world. Now, quite a lot of people are working on that, on making people realize how severe depression is, and in general terms, how bad it is for the world if we want to maximize pleasure or happiness and diminish pain and suffering. And now a general point about pleasure and happiness and societies. When you look at the global measurement of happiness, for example, yes, again, there are those elements that we believe are objective sources of satisfaction, which is different from pleasure, of course, but of satisfaction or pleasure for human beings. So, all in all, I'm hopeful that we could establish things, and that they are, at least on the basic level, they are not so difficult to decide what we should do to make the world a better place, especially in some places of the world, in most places of the world, really. What do you think?
No, I'm very thankful for your answer, for all of them.
Thank you.
Okay, Giulio Fornaroli, please.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. So if I understand you correctly, you are very keen on saying that your proposal is purely axiological and not normative. Still, as an axiological proposal, it sounds like a kind of reductionism. You're essentially saying all that matters, all that has value, is pleasure. Okay, and you think that that's an advantage of your proposal, because that leads to a monist view, and a monist view avoids conflicts, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not sure that I saw that passage from your theory about pleasure, about what pleasure is, to the further passage where we establish that pleasure is the only value, is the only thing that matters. Because it seems to me a perfectionist could always respond by saying, well, pleasure is, of course, a very valuable thing, because well, following your theory, because it's sort of a sensation to which we attach a positive thought, a sensation to which we attach a desire to keep having that thing, or something like that. Okay, and that of course matters, right? But there are other things that matters. Value does not stop there, right? It also matters that I don't know, that certain features of the environment are preserved, or that I don't know, certain works of art are preserved, or that the future generations keep having what we are having, and things like that, right? Regardless of whether there is any single person who can feel pleasure about these sorts of things, or they may say it matters that well, classic Razian perfectionists could say it matters that individuals have autonomy and the ability of choosing certain things, and regardless of whether that brings them pleasure. So yeah, I wonder whether the theory you have offered today is sufficient to explain not simply what pleasure is, but also why pleasure and only pleasure matters. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a perfect question. And I can, very shortly, I can ask, I know I can't really hope for that. For example, in the book that I've just written in Polish, I say, I confess that I want to prove that pleasure is a value in itself, but it's not the only pleasure. What I'm trying to show is about those monistic and pluralistic theories that on the level of theory, not of choice between values, it's easier to follow monism than pluralism. And by the way, I wrote about it in this book, the Oxford Handbook of Consequentialism, edited by Douglas Portmore. If you are interested, it's now, I think, open access at the Oxford University Press. But answering your question, as with all the values, I think a lot depends on intuitions and on the examples you give, yes. So I still agree that there are many other values, but if you ask me whether environment has a value in itself, or a piece of art, a beautiful painting has a value in itself, apart from people who can experience that, beings, I don't know, maybe future AI, I don't really believe that it is. But as we know, these are my intuitions, and you may have very different. So I can nudge you, probably, yes. I can ask about what you would choose, whether a painting or a being who can suffer, and so on. But I know it has its limits, and still you may give answers that are different or completely different from mine. And I think it's fine. I don't believe I can do anything more. It may be disappointing, but I don't know how else to do that. So thanks. That's a great point. To my despair, but it's a great point.
Is there another question?
Yes, can I ask a question?
Yeah, please, Fabiola, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry for jumping in. I had well, anyway, it's a long explanation. But you're saying you're a monist because it's easier to follow. But what if pluralism is true? I mean, and monism has so many problems that you have to go pluralistic. I mean, that's a follow-up to Julio's question, but I had another question. Henry Sidgwick was very concerned with ethics. I mean, with the normative implications of these theories. So you've been saying that your position is axiological, what you're presenting. But following Sidgwick, you have to give something about the normative implications. Maybe it's not just your purpose in this particular talk, but I still want to ask you about it. You already answered about the collective dimension, and you said that in that area, Kantianism or the ontology in general work better. And what about the interpersonal dimension? I mean, in our everyday lives, if we say, oh yeah, he don't know this theory of pleasure is good, then, but how should we go about making decisions, weighing pleasures? How about the rights of other people? I mean, what I'm concerned in particular is how to weigh maximization of pleasure in the way you are, from this normative perspective, in the way you're characterizing it, and other values that are important, like the freedom of other people, their rights. It was a long time I read Sidgwick, so I don't remember, but I think he has a distinction between what is called act and rule utilitarianism. So at the end, I don't remember I don't know if I remember incorrectly, but he defends some sort of rule utilitarianism. And then there's this passage when he says, well, but it's important that people follow certain rules. That's the best way to maximize whatever is being maximized. I don't remember, the good or and it's best that people don't know. I remember this, and that's what I wanted to ask you about in this normative implication. So it's best, it may be best that people don't know what this is what they are doing, because maybe they'll find a shortcut and just go straight for the good and dismiss the rules, or in a particular occasion at least. So I wanted to press you more on that point, on the normative implications for our everyday interactions. What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to be waiting how to maximize pleasure? Are we supposed to follow rules? How are we going to take into account other values, liberty, the rights of other people? That's it.
Okay, thank you. Terrific. As for the first question about the normativity, I confess again that I wanted this division because I think that hedonism may be first cleared away from different problems when you do not yet judge how to bring about pleasure. Yes, so the normative question of how you should do certain things, how you should maximize the value. But of course, as you correctly pointed out, it's a necessary element as well. And I'm a utilitarian. I believe that pleasure should be maximized. So I'm a maximatist utilitarian. Now, there are different ways of doing that. Some believe that you don't need to maximize. But I think that in the world as it is now, with so much pain, that's the reasonable thing, because there is so much to do. And I take that you should do that more or less in impartial way, yes? So I believe in impartial moral reasons for action, in sort of the perfect now proposed on what matters. So that's the normativity, but of course there is this huge discussion, you mentioned Sidgwick, about the struggle or the push between partial and impartial reasons for actions, yes? So it's a complicated and a bit separate discussion, but I believe that we should argue that rationality goes with impartiality, more or less, yes? So partial reasons are not really rationally objective reasons. Now to your second excellent question about the practice, that's a really great thing. I think usually we all act according to certain rules, yes? So you can either think of it as a a choice between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Because really in rule utilitarianism, you could think of all sorts of those rules that would justify also the autonomy and the freedoms of others and so on. But I try to think of it in the prism of something that I call the risk theory. So I know that I can be mistaken, and I try to act so as to minimize the harm that I could do. And since I know that at least in what they say, people are not all hedonists. Yes, they value different things. Then knowing that I might be mistaken, I take that into account as well, and I try to act in accordance with what they want or what they believe in some, of course, reasonable borders. Yes. As for Sidgwick and following the rules, that's a really lovely passage. We take it as unacceptable or strange or psychic or whatever we call it. But if we proceed with giving arguments, some of the arguments work, and we can see what kinds of arguments work. Sometimes these are not reasonable arguments, these are emotions, for example. In terms of not eating animals, PETA, an American organization, uses emotions quite often, yes, to push people toward an action that they believe is right and the value they want. There is I don't know whether you had that in mind or not, but there is this really interesting aspect of utilitarianism as a theory, which Parfit calls self-effacing. Yes, so he says that utilitarianism is self-effacing, is hiding behind other theories, using them as instruments to bring about the best possible consequences we can have under the conditions we have. So, of course, utilitarianists can, I believe, use all of that, use the ontology and virtue ethics and talk about character and talk about the importance of rules in a society and in politics. Utilitarianists can talk about the importance of being open with rules and your intentions, all of it, because we take into account the whole psychological aspect of who we are and how we act and how we view the values. So in a way, in terms of instruments, it's a very, very broad theory. It can swallow most of ethics, I believe. It's only when you start talking about a true theory, then utilitarianism would say, yeah, take me, right? Because then it will try to argue that the reasons or the first principles or axioms they propose are the true ones, yes, or are objectively true. Does it answer your question?
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, is there any other question? Time is almost over. So, well, we should bring this to an end. I think this has been a very pleasant and a very pleasurable session with Kasia, and we'll want to thank you for this great talk. Yeah, and we hope to see you in Mexico sometime soon.
I would love that. I would absolutely love that. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you that you wanted to listen to me. Even more for your great questions. Some of them, or even most of them, troublesome questions, but that's what we are used to as philosophers. So that's fine. I got used to that. Especially a hedonist has sometimes hard time. So
Okay.
That's wonderful, really wonderful, and thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you, Kasia. Can I say something else? It's just, I don't know.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. And I'm going to switch to Spanish.
Okay, so I will say goodbye and leave the meeting, yes?
If you like. Thank you so much.
And I hope you stay healthy and well, and all the best for all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, likewise.
Bye.
Bye. Bueno, muchas gracias, Gustavo, por la ponencia de hoy, por invitar a Kasia. Y quería solamente decir dos cosas. Una es que esta sería la última sesión del semestre del seminario y retomaríamos en agosto. Si están interesados en participar y en hacer propuestas, por favor, escríbanos. Y la otra es un mensaje de la Comisión de Igualdad de Género. Les enviamos un cuestionario que nos gustaría mucho que pudieran contestar antes del viernes, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, esos eran los dos avisos y nos estamos viendo. Muchas gracias por todo, por asistir al seminario este semestre y nos vemos muy pronto. Chao.
Gracias, Tere.
Gracias, Gustavo. Gracias a todos y a todas.
No, gracias.
Gracias, chao.